welcome to the West Trade Review PostScript interview series. I am West Trade Review's fiction editor, Dan White, and I'm here talking with Coco Picard, whose new book, The Healing Circle, will be published on August 16th from Hen Press. So thank you for joining me, Coco.
Thanks for having me.
Very excited about this book. And I think, so Coco, I suppose for our listeners, Coco and I were, I guess, in the same cohort. We're in the same pod, as we called it, at Stony Brook University's bookend program last year. And so that's how I first became familiar with this book, kind of in its infancy, I suppose, or something. And so I think one thing that'd be interesting, and Coco, you have such an interesting background, to start off here is maybe tell us maybe a little bit about, maybe a little bit about the book itself or your process generally, and then maybe just the genesis and the origins of the book, and maybe a bit about yourself as a writer. I know you, as I said, you have such an interesting background. So if you want to give us a little bit of that, maybe.
It's really nice to be here, and it's also really exciting to talk to you, Dan, in particular, because I feel like we have had so many conversations about this book and our writing and your writing over time. So yeah, I feel like you have a real connection to the work and how it has developed. So thanks for having me. I'm trying to think of where to start. I mean, I guess I feel like when I've talked about this book so far, and even just in my mind, there's a way where the point of origin has to do with my own mother's death. And my mother had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. She was diagnosed when I was about 9 and was in and out of remission until her death when I was 22, I think, 22 or 23. And she was a New Age enthusiast, and she did go to Munich looking for a miracle cure when she was given a terminal diagnosis. And I feel like there's something about that is the framework. But it also took me a long time to write the book, and I think largely because I had to get farther and farther away from the real situation that I knew. And a lot of the details or maybe most of the details are totally different. Like, for instance, I was there and I was helping take care of her. My siblings were helping, to different extents, and based on everybody was sort of attending to her to the best of our abilities. But I couldn't, what should I say? I guess I feel like when I initially tried to write the book, I was trying to write from the perspective of a child, and it was impossible. Or I found it impossible. And I think in some way it was because, like, I think I was drawn to write this book because I ultimately wanted to understand why somebody would leave their family and everything they knew in order to die somewhere else. And in order to arrive at that question, I had to separate myself and the characters and the world of the book from the specifics of my mother and my relationship to my mother and my siblings' relationship to our mother and my relationship to my siblings, and our extended family and like our own, family history. But so then in creating that separation, I feel like suddenly there was this kind of core, like, existential question. And then it was kind of like the hospital where my mother did eventually pass away in. It's almost like that became like the set piece for the novel. And I've spent a lot of time in hospitals, usually on the, sitting beside a hospital bed. And so I also feel like there's something about the feeling of those spaces that I was really interested in. And I think it's interesting that novels are like, I feel like there's this obligation to present like linear movement where you need a plot to go from A to B. And I was interested in what would happen if, like, what if the main frame is just the same all the time? Um, yeah, I mean, I guess that's sort of maybe a beginning answer.
No, that's a great answer. I think so. Actually, this kind of brings up something that I hadn't thought about. And so I suppose for people who obviously aren't familiar with the book yet, it there is, as you mentioned, Coco. It begins in the hospital room in Munich with the character who's named Mother, and it's written in a series of vignettes. I think about 175. Is that where you landed at? Something in
Yeah,
that
I
range,
can't
right?
remember. I should know that, but yeah, I don't know.
137. Excuse me, I conflated my numbers. 137. Anyway, and and so from this place in the hospital room, we ended up getting a lot of her backlight, her backstory, essentially, but in scene. And we'll get. I think we can get into that kind of technique later. But one thing that you mentioned that I'm interested in is so as you say, everything sort of emanates from this hospital room is maybe a way to put it, right? And so she and the fictive president is in there throughout the course of the book. It carries through, and also everything. Most of what happens is either her memories of other events in the past. So we move locations by memory, or they're her her family interacting with her, through the telephone or something. But there's a connection, there's a nexus to that hospital room. So, and I know some of this from our time, working together as you were revising it, maybe even, outside of that or before bookings or anything. How did you find the constraints of your setting? So once you kind of got to this point, and you said, okay, and I'm interested to hear if you have, anything on kind of how you got to that decision to focus it in that particular setting. But once you did get there, where did you find, just from a craft perspective, perhaps we'll say, that was how did you interact with those constraints? How did you maybe, I'm sure in some ways they were a hindrance, in some days maybe they were a help too. But what was your experience? Because that is somewhat of a, if not unique, at least fairly unusual or original aspect of the book. And so, how did you interact with that from a craft angle, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can't remember like how the form occurred to me in terms of writing these short vignettes. I think part of it is that I was really interested in trying to make a very somehow like a humble novel about somebody's life. Um, in other words, like what does it mean to tell a life in 137 vignettes that are about, maximum 2 pages? And I guess I was interested in how that was kind of like I don't want to say anti-heroic, but like, it feels like it's the opposite of what you're supposed to do if you're setting out to write the great novel, which should be like thousands of pages and like keep a door open, kind of a heavy door. And so in some ways I think that that's kind of where it started. And then I also remembered this. It's funny, like the references that float around and influence you years and years and years later. But there's this really great reference of a Cumaean Sibyl. Yeah, there's this old reference that was kind of floating around. And in Virgil's Aeneid, there's this I mean, I think she barely makes an appearance, or she's not, she's certainly not the center of the book, but it's this idea that there's this command Sybil and she lives in a cave and she writes down I think she writes down the history or the future of the world. And then she gathers the leaves and she puts them in a stack and she leaves them right outside of her door. And then people have to go and collect them, because if they don't collect them, they'll get scattered and thrown out of order. And then you miss the message or something. And so I feel like I was interested in like what it would mean to create a book where the sequence was like out of order, but also under the with the premise somehow that everything could be happening all at once, because that's sort of how, I mean, I feel like the older I get, the more I'm struck by how memory inflects my present, and also how much conceptions of the future are like entering my consciousness. So even right now this summer, I feel like there's like a part of my consciousness that's like in the fall already and like already in winter. And that's to say that doesn't even take into account the way I'll smell something. Like it rained really heavily and there was a smell that I remembered from like the last time that I'd been on the East Coast, which was probably at this point like 6 years ago or something, and so how do you contain all of those things while still being considerate of a like fundamentally linear structure? Because when you're reading, you're going from one page to the next, to the next, to the next. So I feel like I had this idea of like trying to write a novel that was entirely in the present, was also not too like showy somehow, which maybe I don't know why that's something I'm particularly interested in or was interested in with this book, but and this like really intense temporal compression. So I feel like even in the times that you and I had talked about the book, there was a way where it like expanded and then had to contract again. And one of the constraints that I arrived at, which was most useful, was to decide that the fictive present of the hospital room was linear and consistently linear. And so that's like really the grounding timeline. And then I feel like there were tricks to how I should try and orient the reader as quickly as possible in the different time cuts, so that hopefully somebody reading the book isn't like distracted trying to figure out when something happens.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And I remember that was a process. So I'm interested in, obviously, you talking a little bit about that with our listeners, in terms of your revision process. I know you working with Meg Wolitzer and through the Stony Brook program and throughout our group as well. But so one thing that I think certainly within this book that helps is that structure. We talked a little bit about it, the vignette structure, as you say. Most of them are, maximum about 2 pages, right? I don't think there's anything go over 2 pages. Maybe there's
I
a
don't know.
page in there. I don't think,
There
right? So
might
there,
be, yeah, anyway,
Mhm.
there might be something
Yeah,
at the end.
and so there's these these very quick vignettes, but I think that helps with your temporal movement, because it kind of gives a little bit of a reset each time, right? And so there's the hospital. We open the hospital, we close the hospital, okay, but then there's within that, I do think one thing that helps keep the reader grounded in your temporal movement in terms of the fictive past, moving through different memories, is that structure, because you're pretty faithful to that, right? Is if you're in a memory from 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 5 years ago, from mother's point of view, if we're in one for specific vignette, we stay there, right, in that vignette. And so yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about that and how you, and as you mentioned, you say you kind of, for at one point you expanded the timeline, and then you had to kind of compress it again. Just want to speak a little bit about to how that your kind of your actual process of within the revision process. Again, both within bookends and maybe beyond. How you kind of work through that, and maybe even with some feedback from others as well. I'm sure people will be interested in hearing that.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, a thing that I really love is I love cutting. Um, and so I feel like the first form of the book, that basically I submitted the manuscript to a contest at the Hen Press, the women's prose contest. And that form of the book that won the prize was significantly shorter. I don't remember how much shorter, but it was much shorter. Like I want to say it was maybe, I don't know, 40,000 words or something. And some of the feedback that I got at that stage was that it was sort of too thin as a book. And I guess when I heard that, it like instantly resonated with me, because I felt like I was avoiding certain details or backstories, or hadn't developed certain details and backstories, but I had like figured out how everything should be staged. So it was almost like basically I feel like when I heard that feedback, what it made me think of was like the book is like a set for a camera, and from like very specific points of view it looks like a full-fledged world. But if you like adjust the camera a little bit, you'll realize that you're not inside of a full-fledged hospital, you're inside of like a soundstage or something. So I feel like then the next phase was like, okay, I'm just going to write. I mean, I know I think it more than doubled. I think maybe it went up to, I don't know, it was like, do you remember, Dan? Like I feel it was like 90,000 words or something. It like totally got huge.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
And I was most uneasy about that phase. Like I felt like then I had this like really bloated novel where I was anxious about a lot of it. Anxious in that like it was like nothing felt in its right place, but everything was there. And so, and that's the point of time where I started working with Meg Wolitzer, and that's the point of time that I also like shared it again with my editor at Red Press, Kate Gale. And I was really fortunate to be able to triangulate the input from Kate and from Meg and kind of get the book into its current form, largely because Kate was like, okay, so you've done a lot of work and it's good, but now you have to bring it back. It can't be more than, and I can't remember what she said, but probably she was like, it can't be more than 60,000 words or whatever the current word count was. And so then I kind of, I mean, it's like so liberating to me to just like go through and like hack off pieces. And I think it's probably like I feel I don't know, that's like the point where I feel most powerful or like invulnerable or something as an author. And like it's great. You're like, I don't need this, and I don't need this either. And so then kind of whittling it back down. Like I think the book really benefited from the expansion, but ultimately it was like a second intense kind of contraction that had to happen. Like, and it's things like, oh, maybe we don't need like two dinner parties with the children or some, you know what I mean? Some other good advice I had was like, in terms of that hospital space where, Ursula, the mother character, is really like kind of, I experience her consciousness as like, it's kind of psychedelic. It's hard to tell how kind of I don't want to say coherent, but like to what extent she is like an active, what should I say, to what extent she is present, maybe, let's just say. And a lot of it also has to do with these like very kind of philosophical questions that she's having. And I think Meg at one point was like, Caroline, a little goes a long way. And that was like another thing. I don't know. It's great to be like, okay, I can like cut 5 of these like hospital ruminations, because we all know what it's like to be in a hospital. So we don't all have to like think about all of the tiny scratches on the floor, on the waxy floor.
And also, it's amazing too, in how if you signpost something early on, I think oftentimes the reader will just carry that through, which is yeah, I know what you mean about the cutting. Although I'm thinking of how you talked about 90,000 words being too much. Where my manuscript in our fellowship was about 130 for a while, so it's all relative. So you talked about kind of the sparsity, and I think it's in there. It's certainly a prominent element of the healing circle, and structurally, of course, which we've talked about. But to a certain extent, the language too. It's in the third person, and you do engage with Ursula's mother's consciousness. But I think you do. You kind of you're in more of maybe a Virginia Woolf world than a James Joyce world, in that engagement consciousness, right? I mean, we'll just put it in that way, and we'll resist my temptation to go too deep into that topic. But I think that so maybe we could talk a little bit about that stylistic technique element of it, and kind of where you landed on in the process of coming to this. Well, I guess actually one thing that's interesting, maybe before we do that, is talk about it is in the third person. And one thing you mentioned at the top was how autobiographical this is, at least maybe on a foundational level, if not a more specific level. Was there a thought early on of putting this in first person? Was that something that you ever thought about, or was it maybe just third person? Was that distance that you mentioned, looking for as to why you didn't write the book for a long time, or, kind of just, I'm interested in that. And, in some ways, of course, third person, you get closer to characters than you do in first as well. So there's that element as well. But I'm just curious about that element.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely feel like the close third person was really important. And I think that, I mean, I think it is somehow about a distance. Like my sense of the manuscript, or my hope for the manuscript, is that it's a very close third. Like you're really there. But it's rare, for instance, where the mother character reflects on whether or not she's actually dying. And I think that's one of the places where, if I remember correctly, it usually comes out when she's relating to her children or thinking about her children. But so it's very hard to know how she, in her innermost thought, is thinking about her place. To what extent does she believe in this cure? She seems to believe in it. She's like gone to great lengths to find it, at great cost, I would say. But there's definitely periods of time where she's like, I don't know if it's working. And then she's like, no, I'm getting better, and that kind of, like, I guess I felt like that flicker of her kind of going back and forth was really important. as a space to witness rather than inhabit.
Well, it's so interesting you mentioned that. I think another element, the narration, again, it does, you're right. I think it is fairly close and it is limited, by and large to her perspective and perceptions. But narration doesn't really do the reader, doesn't really help us out with what she feels like she knows. And I remember this is something that we talked about in the bookends program as a group was, there's speculation as to maybe whether she's actually died or, if she's, to where she exactly is kind of in that space, I suppose. But the narration never really comes out and tells us, and it never really gets into that. So, and I'm interested in that kind of, it's almost like, it's almost like this central question of the book is almost, walked around in some ways. And I guess I'm interested in your thoughts on that, and then I have another question off of that. But if if there's anything about, kind of how is that maybe an element of it that you found, again, relating to some of these autobiographical elements? Was that something that was maybe useful in terms of looking at kind of the, instead of, you mentioned earlier, avoiding kind of this, I think you said this big, extravagance or something in the book, and instead looking at it in kind of on the oblique a little bit. And so I think it's interesting that, again, I suppose in that, within vis-a-vis that, I suppose that the narration does really avoid that sort of direct, not only giving us any direct reflection from Ursula on whether her mortality, or literally whether she's dead or alive, or whether she believes in the cure or anything like that, but also the narration itself doesn't give us in terms of, expository information or anything like that. It really is avoiding that. So I'm interested in kind of that element of it, vis-a-vis some of these things you've mentioned it as goals for where you were writing the book.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think that there's something about I mean, it's like the relationship between evasion and clarity that I think is really interesting. Like another way that I experience and ultimately like structured the narrative around is this sense that especially the mother, when she arrives in Munich, is not attending to certain aspects of her past, and she's sort of avoiding them. And then like, and this is like, these are things that kind of come up in the vignettes. And so I feel like I was sort of thinking about what makes it possible to let go of life. Like in some ways I feel like Ursula, her whole premise for, or the mother, her whole premise for arriving in, her going to Germany is to like find this miracle cure, get better, have restored movement in her legs, never get cancer again. She has this sort of idea that if that were to happen, she would transform the face of Western medicine. So she has this kind of like, hero savior complex. And like, I guess there's a part of me that feels like she has like deliberately deluded herself to coming to a place where she's doing a totally different kind of work, like inner work. And the inner work is like, she has to deal with some really traumatic episodes in her life. And those traumatic episodes, I mean, this is a very psychological interpretation, maybe, but those traumatic episodes are the things that like prevent her from actually dying, which is actually maybe what needs to happen. And I think there was a way where, like, I guess my approach to thinking about the language in this book was that there's no excess, or as little excess as possible. And definitely whenever I'm editing, whether it's like on the line level or the larger page level or chapter level, I feel like I was constantly asking myself, is this necessary? Like, do I need this word? Is this word doing anything? I can get rid of it. And then I get a little, I'm like very happy if I get rid of it, you know? But I think, and that happens similarly in vignettes. Do you need this? Do we need to know this backstory? Maybe not. Um, but I think that for me, that was a way of trying to like have this ongoing implication of a bigger world and even like a bigger psychological world that the mother character Ursula is negotiating. And as the book progresses, she deals with that space and addresses it, and it like enters the narrative once she is willing to acknowledge it.
And it's funny you mentioned the Aeneid earlier. So, and I think we talked about this back in our fellowship, but this is, in some ways, this is her Odyssey, right? Is a journey towards, she has to go through kind of her past in order to end up at a place where she can, actually kind of let go, right? Which is, it makes for a very compelling book. And I think that, I think that's fascinating. You mentioned earlier in your answer there, evasion and kind of this scarcity of style. And so, and I think that's something that I know we wanted to hit on, which was, you know, we talked maybe a little bit about this, but literary ancestry, or kind of where you see the book in terms of maybe the current literary landscape, your influences, things like that, I think are all very interesting. I think there's certainly there are a number of books that I think you can see as maybe having some sort of connective tissue to the healing chamber, as to the healing circle. And I think of Rachel Cusk, especially. I think when you think of kind of this sort of, especially her outline series, where you've got this sort of, there's this center and everything is being filled in around it, and I think maybe in the outline series it's a little bit more directly the focus, whereas you have other foci perhaps, but the stylistic approach I think is similar in that way, and there's a sparsity of language, and there's this kind of kind of very clean, pared down sense. And by the end, you end up having this thing filled in, even though we never kind of transverse it directly, right? We kind of moved on the oblique. I think maybe there are other, Jenny Awful's work a little bit. I think you could look at that, something like Topics of Conversation from recent years, even something like, Speedboat or something, I think, if nothing else structurally. But so, those are just kind of obviously connections I see. So I'm of course curious to see what you see in terms of, again, literary ancestry, and it can be older than the more recent books we talked about that I mentioned there, but just kind of where maybe who you drew on, or who you inspired by, who you just want to see yourself in conversation with, whether it's maybe it's pushing against kind of a certain type of style or movement or something as well, but kind of that sort of where you maybe see your book in kind of conversation with others in the literary world.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like one of the things that I think is funny is the more it's like the farther I get from writing, and the more I'm thinking about what it was to have written the Healing Circle, the more kind of references I stumble into or realize were affecting me. I mean, I think Suzanne Scanlon's Promising Young Women was a big influence early on, as what I had been. I also remember, I mean, it's like the question of the female protagonist in a space of constraint. And so I also think I like later was influenced a lot by Atesha Moshfegh's My Year of Rest and Relaxation. Also Jamaica Kincaid's At the Bottom of the River is this like collection of short stories that I think it was one of her earliest, or maybe it's her earliest work, that sort of glanced through different mother-daughter relationships. And I think, then there's also like newer books, which are exciting to me. Like, there's a book called Bitch by Pilar Quintana, which is sort of like, instead of the mother-daughter relationship, or the mother-child relationship, is replaced with like a dog. So the protagonist finds an